Okay. Thank you, both Eric and Eric, for the kind words. And I'm happy to share more about, I guess, my time. Oh, do we not need this? My time as an extra on a documentary where I guess I co-appeared with Kevin Bacon. We didn't actually meet. We were not in the same scene or anything like that. Moving to the magic of code, which we'll be talking about tonight. So our conversation around computing and technology, it feels kind of broken right now. I'm really interested in computers, as you will it'll become abundantly clear very quickly. But when people think about computers and computing, we often think about computation and code as like a narrow engineering discipline. Or if we think about it in terms of broader aspects of society, it's often very negative. We talk about big tech ruining our civilization, smartphones are bad for our kids, social media is the worst. These are all probably true. But that was not my own experience with computing growing up. And for me, it was I grew up on SimCity and fractals and screensavers and all these kind of weird things. And for me, computing was so much more than all of just kind of the negative things. It was actually a liberal art. And for me, like when you properly view it that way, it has the possibility of actually connecting to language and philosophy and biology and art and how we think and all these different areas. It can actually be a window into understanding the complexity of the world around us. And it can even act as a source for wonder. So one of the frames I like to use to think about this is around the idea of enchantment and disenchantment. So we live in an age of disenchantment, or at least that's the story that we have told ourselves. We went from a world full of magic and gods and powers to one drained of such things, or at least where that frame is no longer the default. And I think that some might tell a similar kind of story when it comes to computing, or at least when it comes to wonder, that we went from delight in the world of computing to things now feeling controlled by large companies and without a lot of delight and excitement. But the truth is, this is not really true. Enchantment and wonder in computing, they've actually always coexisted alongside this kind of more boring or corporate or utilitarian frame. So for example, we had mainframes run by large organizations, but at the same time, also delightful, playful games like Space War, which was run on a mini computer, which is not actually that mini. They were the size of refrigerators. And then when we moved to personal computers, we had both enterprise software like spreadsheets, but also personal computers that were more geared towards delight, like the Macintosh. And in the more modern day of the internet, we have both Stripe, which is kind of this very, very corporate kind of thing of managing payments, to the world of weird online toys like Neil.fun, which I highly recommend. It's just all these weird things. These are all part of what is known as, some people refer to this as the poetic web. And the truth is, all these kind of weird and delightful things alongside the more utilitarian frames, they've always coexisted. And they often actually feed off of each other, with the utilitarian work often acting as the infrastructure and the foundation for the wonder. And then the wonder, exciting programmers to get involved in building more of these massive computational cathedrals. But we too often forget about this kind of thing. So this is my grandfather. He lived until the age of 99, and he was a dentist. But he also, in addition to being a dentist, read science fiction since the modern dawn of the genre. He read Dune when it was actually serialized in a magazine. He knew all the stories. And so when the iPhone first came out in 2007, I went to the Apple store with my father and my grandfather, and we went to the store to check out the new iPhone. And as we're playing with it, my grandfather says at one point, he says, "This is it. This is the object I've been reading about for all these years." But too often, we've forgotten this. We complain about battery life, or screen resolution, or camera resolution, or the weird bugs in our apps. And we don't realize this is an object of science fiction. We need to actually rekindle this sense of wonder in computing. So and that was the goal of this book, to kind of rekindle that wonder, all while taking ultimately a deeply humanistic approach to computing. And so one of the key ways to do this involves looking at the past, both kind of because it's actually a very interesting thing to look at, but it also gives you a sense of paths not taken and the deep path dependence. And so trying to understand the history is actually very, very valuable to kind of understand where we are and why we actually understand these kinds of things and where we can go. So before I discuss kind of where we might go and things like that. First of all, maybe we should start with, what is code? This will be very high level. But code, at least as we generally think of it, it's something in between language and math. It's rigorous, but it's also open-ended. It involves a kind of combination of rules and logic and mathematics, using often this kind of stripped-down version of English to very precisely tell a machine what to do, how to manipulate data and information. It's essentially a series of instructions for the computer to follow, to take the ideas in our heads and then turn them into programs that can operate in the world. So what this means then is that code is not really a kind of material that we're used to. It's not a physical material like concrete or wood or stone, but it's also not just text. It's text that actually can operate in the world. It's something that can be run using the properties of our machines, following kind of the series of instructions that tell these machines what to do. And they're essentially spells of crystallized thought. So programming then is also the embodiment of the desires we've had for millennia to kind of coerce the world with text, to use text and language to control the world around us. And now we have this. I mean, we've yearned for this for millennia, but ever since, I don't know, 75, 80 odd years ago, with the advent of the digital computer, we've gone from stories of magic to reality. And so if you look at actually the way magic is portrayed throughout history, as well as in our stories, and magic and sorcery, they're not just magic. It doesn't just work. Spells and precise conjurings or whatever, these are all hard work, whether it requires kind of consulting the books of ancient times or 7 years of education at Hogwarts. So too with the world of code. It requires effort. You have to learn how these things work. And in fact, the more you look at the nature of magic, the more that this metaphor has intriguing similarities. Now, to be clear, I don't want to push the metaphor too far until it breaks. But for example, there's the idea of names. So names have power. Knowing the true name of something can kind of give you power over it. So this is true in Rumpelstiltskin, in ancient myth, in the novels of Ursula K. Le Guin in her fantasy novels. So too with computing. And variables, how we work with them, these are a type of names, and they can have a great deal of power. And there are even ones with runaway control, which are known as global variables, which is often far too powerful to entrust to regular mortals. And if you're in the programming world, you know that you don't want to actually use these things called global variables. They're kind of like the Tolkien's rings of power in a world of everyday wedding bands. We also have the notion of sacrifice in magic, where something of value must be given for a spell to work. And so too in the realm of artificial intelligence. We have to sacrifice huge amounts of text or images or whatever, all on the altar of training these massive models. So magic and code in some ways are not so different. But what is the origin of the computational magic? How does it actually do what it does? So the ancient rabbis of the Talmud, they spoke of how the entire world was created from 10 utterances. So this is based on reading the story of creation in Genesis, where you kind of tally up the number of times God says, "Let there be," and then the world unfurled from there. And to be clear, this is not a quote from the Bible. This is actually part of a Calvin and Hobbes comic. But the same kind of thing is actually possible in computing. It turns out you can use a few simple rules, and then the computer can then computationally unfurl whatever algorithm you have, and then create a great deal of complexity. So these are what I call emergent microcosms. And we have them. You take a few small, simple instructions, and then the relentless nature of the machine can create a huge amount of complexity. And this complexity just kind of emerges. So this is what's known as John Horton Conway's game of life. It's one of what is known as cellular automata. And basically what they do is they use very simple rules for squares, turning black or white, based on the other squares that are around them. And it turns out from these very, very simple rules, and you can embody this on the order of 10 lines of code, a huge amount is revealed. You end up getting weird behaviors. So in this case, you get these weird little waggling things that are known as gliders. Here is a pattern that actually just keeps on shooting off gliders off into infinity, off into the distance. People have actually built entire computers inside this game of life, and it can be described using a very, very small set of rules. And you can see the same kind of thing in the world of screensavers or more modern, kind of the world of creative coding. What you do is you have a small program, sometimes bound up with a certain amount of randomness or pseudo-randomness, because computers actually don't have true randomness. And then you get so much out of it. Sometimes you even get surprising or unexpected complexity. So why is this so? So it has to do with the fundamental features of the computer. To quote Richard Feynman, The inside of a computer is dumb as hell, but it goes like mad. So computers they can take a small rule set, and with the untiring, relentless nature of the machine, spin out huge amounts of these diverse microcosmos. The computer will do little bits of math or numerical manipulation over and over, and it all adds up to something exciting. Because computers, and they're these massive edifices, and they're doing simple operations, but so quickly and so many times over and over that something qualitatively novel and interesting actually can result. This is also related to kind of the basic idea of scientific simplicity and the idea of physics. So you might have like very, very simple rules of how physics operates, but you run them over and over the entire universe, and you end up with the diversity and wonder of the cosmos. So in the computational realm, you can get things like this weird digital creature, which is actually created with simple rules kind of along the lines of the game of life. It's kind of a more smooth version of this. This is actually also on the order of 10 lines of computer code. Here's another one. This is also from the realm of artificial life. You can get this other weird thing, and it looks almost organic or biological, but it's entirely computational, using a very small set of rules. So the downside of this, though, is that even with this simplicity, we begin to lose the capability to understand these aspects of our computational technologies. And of course, this is compounded when our software and systems are not just 10 lines of code, but consist of tens of millions of lines of computer code, which is the reality for much of our software. So the extreme is when we end up with situations like what are known as legacy code or legacy systems. This is the situation where you have a piece of software or a technological system that accretes. It kind of grows over time. Features are added where you kind of build the new upon the old. The old might not still be fully understood, but it's still essential for making everything work. So for example, I believe as of several years ago, the IRS was still using computer systems that were developed during the Kennedy administration. In fact, as of several years ago, floppy disks were still being used for our nuclear program. And so what this means is that the new is being built upon the old, with the end result a big system that works, but no one might fully understand it anymore. The original designers, they might be long retired or even dead. So I was talking to someone who used to work at Los Alamos National Labs, where they do these like, large computational simulations of nuclear explosions. And he told me that periodically he would come across chunks of computer code that would have comments around it saying, "Do not touch this. We do not know what it does." And of course, this is far from the exception. This kind of thing is fairly common. And the truth is, we don't even need to look to big systems either. So here's someone describing a Windows desktop machine as so complex that no one person on Earth really knows what all of it is doing or how. So these technological systems, they're extremely complex. Due to their nature, they're hard to understand. Something I explored also in my previous book, Overcomplicated. And this is all compounded by the idea that, by something we often forget, that computers are deeply physical. We think of them as kind of like information processing and kind of this weird evanescence, but they're deeply physical machines. So I don't know if some of you might remember a number of years ago where a US senator was talking about how the internet is a series of tubes, and he was kind of widely vilified. But the truth is, and there's actually an entire book called Tubes about the infrastructure of the internet is deeply physical. It relies on data centers and servers, and of course we're now seeing this increasingly with AI, where people are trying to actually build these massive things that require huge amounts of energy. So like these things are physical, and so there's a great example I read about a number of years ago where people were in a hospital and they noticed that when their iPhones, when they were in proximity to a certain MRI machine, their iPhones and Apple Watches stopped working, but Android devices were entirely fine. And it turned out this MRI machine had a helium leak, and it turned out helium atoms were just the right size to actually affect the switches in Apple devices, but not Android devices. And it was this weird thing, and of course, you wouldn't even think about that kind of thing and the deep physicality of it until this kind of situation. There's another story, this kind of a classic glitch story, where a systems administrator at a university was told about, he was informed that the members of this department, they could only send emails to people about 500 miles away. And the systems administrator said, that's kind of insane, that's not how email works. But it turns out, through careful discovery and analysis, that there was an older system that was being used, but then it would kind of clash with a newer one, and then it would time out, and it would time out after some very small amount of time. And it turns out if you multiplied that very small amount of time times the speed of light, you would get something around 500 miles. And so there's these deep physical things that we think about. And so whether it's forgetting the physicality of computing or just grappling with the breakdown between how to understand these systems when they are mind-bogglingly complex, we are often left with glitches and failures. So how do we understand these kinds of systems? So one way is to actually look at the structure of these systems and see if maybe there's kind of patterns that we can learn from these kinds of things. So for example, when we're describing big technologies, we often describe them as complex, messy systems that evolved over time, have an almost organic level of complexity. We're using terms from biology. And in fact, this is not a technological system, or at least kind of a constructed technological system. This is the metabolic pathways within a cell. But it looks almost like technology. And so maybe we should take this analogy seriously. If we are approaching biology in terms of in the level of complexity, maybe we can look at how biologists think about complex biological systems and use the same sort of techniques, or essentially become field biologists for technologies. So what sort of techniques could we use as field biologists? So one of them is to learn from bugs. So we can actually, like the naturalists of old, collecting insects, butterflies. When you're learning how an entire system works, you slowly but surely collect information and build up a picture and better understanding over time. And the same kind of thing can actually apply to technology. So when a system is too complex to fully understand, you can examine the details and build this more complex picture. We can also take it a little bit more literally and actually collect bugs, collect errors, and glitches. Biologists, actually, they do this a lot. They exploit mutations in organisms in order to learn about a system. Neurologists do this by looking at, they learn about the brain based on when people suffer brain injuries. And when they have certain brain injuries, that actually teaches us about how the brain operates. And the same kind of thing can apply to technology. So we can learn from our bugs or glitches, like the 500-mile email, the helium atom leak. Because sometimes when a system is so complex, the only way to get an insight into how it actually works is when something goes wrong. So I guess now over 25 years ago, when Deep Blue played the chess champion Garry Kasparov, it made this kind of curious move. And the outside analysts were divided over this mysterious move made by the program, thinking it either weak or obliquely strategic. And it turns out it was just due to a bug. It was not due to some weird complex thing going on. And they were able to use this bug in order to actually gain further insight into the system. But of course, we don't have to wait just for errors. We can actually inject errors into a system to learn. We do this in biology. We irradiate bacteria and then kind of create mutations, then see how genes function. This is kind of the process of mutagenesis. You can do the same kind of thing in technological systems. There's actually, so Netflix has deployed a system known as Chaos Monkey, where we'll actually periodically just take systems down in order to make sure that these systems are as robust as possible. And there is as small a difference as possible between how the system should operate and how it actually does operate. People have done this also with supercomputers, where they'll actually inject errors, like flipping bits randomly into the system to see whether or not those kinds of things matter. We can also look towards how ecologists operate. When you're an ecologist, you don't try to understand an entire ecosystem at once. You might look at a single species or a single pair of species and slowly but surely build up a more complete picture. And this is how field biologists operate. We can do a similar kind of thing with technology. We can kind of take this iterative tinkering approach, like in large machine learning and AI systems, where you look at the parts, you try to figure out what's going on under the hood, because these things are essentially like black boxes and enormously complicated, and slowly but surely build a more complete picture. And of course, the lack of our understanding has also been compounded by how technology has changed over time. So this is the Commodore VIC-20. In the words of its pitchman, William Shatner, it was the wonder computer of the 1980s. This was also the first computer for my family. It connected to your television, used kind of cassettes to save information. And you could purchase programs, but one of the common ways in which you would get software was you would use what are known as type-ins. You would flip to the back of a computer magazine, and actually there would just be pages of code, and you would just manually type it in. And so when we had this computer, I was actually too young to program, but I was able to see my father typing these things in manually, and the clear relationship between the text and what was happening on the screen, sometimes yielding a computer game, more often than not just yielding some weird glitch and a whole bunch of just random code. And so we kind of need these sort of gateways to the machine to kind of allow us to kind of have a small distance between the machine and understanding. But we've become a little bit more detached from our technology and how it operates. We now have things like the iPad, which is slick metal and glass or plastic. I'm not really entirely sure how all the files on it are stored. There's not really an ability to peek under the hood. Sometimes that is until things go wrong, and then you're kind of a little bit of what's going on under the hood is revealed. But too often we don't understand these technologies. And as a result, we get examples like this. So this is a quote from the, I think the style section of the Wall Street Journal soon after the Apple Watch came out. Someone was talking about whether or not they're still going to use mechanical watches. And he said, "When I wear a mechanical watch, I think of the precision required to make it work on such a micro scale. That's pretty awesome, as opposed to just a chip." Now, I will not deny that mechanical watches require a great deal of craftsmanship, but that's not the point. A microchip, it's orders of magnitude more complex than the mechanism within a mechanical watch. But this complexity is hidden. And so therefore, people don't even realize how complex these things are. And so we need ways to kind of expose this complexity, at least even a little bit. Now, and some of this is actually due to the way that programming itself has changed over time. It used to involve writing strings of zeros and ones or manipulating switches and cables, but then it became writing text. And now AI is changing what coding and software means once again. And we're in a moment where computers are the ones writing programs, something it could be potentially destabilizing, although actually quite exciting in the world of software. But that can cause a certain amount of distancing from our machines. But related to this, I'm actually reminded of another story from the Jewish Talmud. And so in this story, Moses is having a conversation with God. And they're talking about this great rabbi far off in the future. And Moses asks to see who this man is. And so there's kind of this moment of time travel. God transports him to the classroom of this rabbi, known as Rabbi Akiva, thousands of years in the future. And it turns out he's listening to what this rabbi is saying. And Moses is actually overwhelmed by what he is hearing until the very end when Rabbi Akiva says that all this is part of the tradition of Moses from Sinai. And then at that point, he's calm because he sees a connection to his own knowledge and what came far after him. There's kind of this, there's this line. And the same kind of thing is true with computing and code. And I don't program in binary or even in the C++ that I learned when I was in high school. And we have Perl that's still around, Python that I use a lot. But we're now creating new methods of programming and speaking to these machines. But these are all in a long tradition of programming, telling our computers what we want them to do. And it'll continue to change. And that might distance us in some ways. And I think we should still try to understand certain aspects of code and try to get closer to our machines. But this kind of situation can be okay. I mean, this is the way change works. And in fact, it has even allowed each of us to build software we might never have been able to build before. So I mentioned earlier that code has the properties of magic. But magic was not just the domain of the expert wizard. It was also for the people. In fact, there were actually spells designed for the average user, such as finding lost objects or getting your cattle back when they kind of wandered away. And so there's actually, similarly, a long history of actually trying to democratize code and software creation, going back many decades. And because the truth is, many of us have ideas for software, not venture-backed big ideas, but like little app ideas, ones that can be just for us, for our family or our friends. This is in the words of the novelist Robin Sloan, an app as a home-cooked meal. And so we need better ways of turning each of our ideas of software into realities. So my first taste of this kind of democratization of code was with a piece of software known as HyperCard. This was an environment built into the Macintosh beginning in the late 80s through the 90s. And it allowed you to build this kind of stack of cards, it was sort of like a primitive website that lived on your own machine. And you could draw, you could write in these stacks, but you could also program. You could actually add a button, make a noise. You could create simple games. And it was actually quite sophisticated. In fact, you could build databases. I believe that the early version of the classic computer game Myst was actually built in HyperCard. HyperCard had, to use the phrase attributed to the computer scientist Seymour Papert, low floors and high ceilings. This is the idea that it was easy to use, but there was a great deal of open-endedness. And it was also, in this case, HyperCard was my on-ramp into programming. I got my first taste with it. I created programs like a simple password generator. It was amazing. And for many years, there was actually nothing quite like HyperCard. In fact, the only thing for many years that was highly democratized in terms of building software was the world of the spreadsheet. As much as we think of spreadsheets as this kind of maligned piece of office software, it actually allows users to write code, even if they don't even realize it. So if you've ever written even a simple formula within Excel, you are actually programming of a kind. But AI is changing this even more. We now have coding tools that allow non-programmers to build software through conversations and autocomplete with AI. So on the right is an iPhone app that a friend of mine, Matt Webb, he made. It's called Galactic Compass. He built it using ChatGPT. So he had long had this idea for an iPhone app where he would want it where no matter where you were pointing your phone, it would show you the location of the center of the Milky Way galaxy 26,000 light years away. And so Matt actually knows how to program, but he didn't actually know how to make iPhone apps. But with ChatGPT, it didn't matter. He was slowly but surely able to have this nice little conversation with ChatGPT and create this piece of software. And this is even more possible now with the advent of vibe coding, where you're kind of just accepting code. And you can make lots and lots of different things using these technologies, ones that are all about this kind of low floors and high ceilings, and apps as home-cooked meals. And this is related more broadly to the idea of tools for thought. And computers, they're not just for calculation. They are mechanisms for helping us to think better. So in the words of Steve Jobs, computers, they can actually act as bicycles for the mind. So he was inspired, this term was inspired by the idea of looking at a chart around, I think, energy efficiencies of different organisms within Scientific American. And so you had, like, there were certain animals that were more efficient, humans were less so, we were kind of, I think, mediocre. But they also included a human being on a bicycle. And suddenly our efficiency skyrocketed. And so that's the hallmark of a good tool. We become much more efficient. And computers, they're particularly good at this kind of thing. They can act as bicycles, but for our own thinking. Whether it's spreadsheets that we can use to model our world, databases to store information, the web that allows us to kind of surf and explore human knowledge, or AI to help write code, these are all tools for thought. And they also have a long and deep pedigree. In fact, just as digital computers were first being developed, the scientist Vannevar Bush, he actually envisioned a device called the Memex. It used, I think, microfiche and projectors to kind of act as this sort of like proto-World Wide Web. It was never actually constructed. It was not a reality for decades, but other luminaries, they were envisioning all different kinds of things. They were talking about things that look like iPads, the idea of hypertext, and these things, they are now all essentially real. But we can do this even more powerfully now today. So artificial intelligence allows us to create what are known as latent spaces. By ingesting unbelievable amounts of text and information, ideas, words, concepts, they're all placed within this kind of high-dimensional, hard-to-imagine virtual space of, like, for the software, where the ideas and words, they're kind of all represented by coordinates. And you can navigate then from one to another, from all these different ideas. And so what this means is that latent spaces can also be used as tools for thought, helping us to see connections between ideas and relationships between concepts, sometimes even actually leading to the development of new ideas and spurs to creativity. Of course, all this can actually cause a certain amount of worry. Are we going to be replaced? AI can do everything we can do. There's actually an idea within theology known as God of the gaps. And so this idea is, like, how do we define God? It's as God is whatever we cannot yet explain. The theological fallacy behind this, though, is that as we learn new things in cosmology and astrophysics and biology or whatever, the idea of God gets smaller and smaller and smaller and suddenly kind of evaporates. And so we're seeing a similar kind of thing with how many people think about themselves in the face of AI. They say, AI is great, but at least it can't do X or Y. And then you wait 10 minutes and suddenly AI can do those kinds of things. And suddenly you don't feel so special anymore. So I actually think what we need to do is think less about what is uniquely human, which might actually go away, and rather what feels quintessentially human, kind of what is quintessential to each of our humanity, even if other people or other species or AI can do it. And the truth is, what is quintessential to our humanity is deeply personal. It can be thinking, spending time with family, gardening, whatever it is. Even if AI can do these things, it's still things that we want to do. I still want to do these things. And so ultimately, what we need to do is think about what are the things that kind of allow us to be the best versions of ourselves. What is kind of the way in which we can use our technology to make us kind of the best humans we can be, rather than kind of allowing these technologies to kind of eclipse our humanity. And so going back to the bicycle for the mind, like, we don't want the AI to think for us, we kind of want to aim this bicycle, this technology, and kind of make it sort of the best versions and allow us to think. Going back to biology, just as we can use AI as a spur to think about meaning and thought, returning to biology, we can also learn about ourselves and life via code. We talked a little bit about this before, but we can actually look at the similarities and differences more deeply between computation and biology. So we can think about life in many, many different ways. But one intriguing dichotomy that I like is what I call the mess versus the information. So one popular mode of thinking about biology is the information. We think about, this involves thinking about like the informational aspect of biology, of like the 4 base pairs of DNA, how they're very similar to the zeros and ones of binary within computers, how there's kind of like this very clear compilation process. DNA goes to RNA, constructs proteins, and those particular structures of the proteins and enzymes kind of construct like all the operations that work in the cell. And it feels very much like a machine kind of doing its thing. Computer programs running inside our cells and bodies. But the truth is, this is only one way of viewing biology. There's also the mess, the wet, stochastic world of biology. Think about the interior of the cell as sort of this like teeming and wild ball pit where everything's vibrating and weird. There's molecules moving helter and skelter in strange ways. And of course, at a higher level, you also have our bodies that are like wet, squelching, creaking things. Everything works, but it's very much a mess. In truth, biology is really both of these kinds of things. And computers are constructed to avoid this mess, but biology actually exploits it. It takes the messiness over a large enough number of molecules on different timescales and becomes much more predictable. So the information sometimes arises because of, or at least in spite of, the mess. In some ways, in fact, computing and biology are actually growing closer, whether it's simulating entire cells or using DNA to run algorithms. But we can actually compress biology, but we compress biology into computing at our peril, thinking of it as only something like software, but with code made of DNA base pairs. Because it turns out, and biology is wildly different. It is something very, very distinct. Instead, what I think is that biology should actually teach us something more intriguing, which is that understanding biology and taking its features seriously can actually teach us how to think about computers even more broadly. So biology processes information, but it does it in a way that is far different than we might imagine. It's far different than our laptops or our phones. Biology is almost computing as it could be. It is deeply physical, it's weird and random, and it's highly parallel. But it's a computation of a sort. And so biology is actually expanding how we might think about the nature of information processing and how strange computing can actually be. Computing can even cause us to examine our place in the universe, or at least use this as kind of a jumping off point. So there's a great graphic novel by John Hendricks called The Mythmakers. It's about the friendship between C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. In it, he explores the idea of myth and what myth does for ourselves and for society. He also explores the need for kind of modern myth-making. And he quotes from another work this idea that, quote, "The right question to ask about myth is not, is it true, but what is it intended to do?" So I have a somewhat different approach to myth than Hendricks. I think of them kind of often like stories we tell to kind of explain ourselves to ourselves and how we fit into the cosmos, ones that also have a certain amount of grandeur. But ultimately, these myths are they're ever present. And it turns out there's actually a lot of myths in the world of technology. And so you can see people talking about superintelligence or the singularity, or there's kind of quests for immortality. And one of the classic myths is this idea of the simulation hypothesis. This is the idea that kind of everything is part of a computer program. So you, me, I don't know, this glass of water, everything. Like we're all kind of like in SimCity, but we don't realize it. And so for some people, this is like of grand cosmic significance, and they think very deeply about this, and it kind of feels like they're, I would say like first-year college students late at night discussing these kinds of things. For me, I am less, I would say, less concerned about these things as like grand cosmic importance with kind of like capital letters, and more about what the idea of simulation hypothesis tells about how we can kind of think about computer programs. And like what this, like if this were true, and to be honest, we have no way of knowing, and it really wouldn't matter even if we knew, and like, well, I guess if we had some real evidence, that would be something. But for me, it's much less about cosmic importance and more about kind of injecting code into systems in weird ways. And so for me, when I think about the simulation hypothesis, I think about this kind of thing. So this is Super Mario World. It was for the Super Nintendo many, many years ago. And a bunch of people, they actually figured out how to exploit glitches within the game. Entirely within the game, you can actually do specific moves and jumps and actually use these as a mechanism to inject computer code in an unexpected way and then get the game to do something unexpected and unplanned and different. And in this case, they actually turned Super Mario World into an entirely different game. I think we'll see it in one moment. So they actually just did these weird jumps and suddenly became Flappy Bird. They basically reprogrammed the entire game inside the game. So can we break out of our world just by jumping around? Probably not. But I'm far less interested in that than like using the idea of the simulation hypothesis. Kind of, for me, it's much more, it's a prompt to think about software and glitches, unexpected behavior, injecting code, learning about the edges of physics, so much more. For me, that feels a lot more exciting and generative than just worrying about the world as a simulation. And it also shows how thinking about a weird thought experiment, simulation hypothesis, can actually be a cause for wonder and not just worry about our place in the universe. So we need more wonder in our world of computing. This is just hopefully giving you just a little bit of a taste. There are also connections to be found between ancient mythology and how open source software is constructed, how to think about the similarities and differences between natural languages and computer languages, the languages we use to program our machines, or even the nature of simulation, and how it actually forces us to think about the limits of our understanding. And I want more of this kind of thing in the world. So where does this leave us? Perhaps with a plea for a new means of approaching all of these kinds of things. We need a humanistic take on computing that explores the ways in which complex and sometimes incomprehensible technologies are intertwined with every aspect of our lives, but one that balances the wonder with the worry, the delight with the despair, the power and the humility, all in service of figuring out how to be human alongside or in partnership with our technologies. This also means understanding the history of technology better. And I've mentioned a lot of computing history, not just because it's fun and interesting, but also because I actually think it's deeply important. We need to understand how we have gotten to the current moment and what has come before us, because the tech world can sometimes be a little ignorant of tech history, occasionally even proudly so. They only care about what is new. So we need to actually build a certain amount of historical literacy in technology and computation in order to better understand previous conversations and debates, older ideas, and paths not taken. And this learning from what has come before us it's also a vital component of creating a better way of figuring out how to be human alongside these technologies. So beginning in the 1970s, the People's Computer Company taught and published about computers. And this is their motto. Computers are mostly used against people instead of for people, used to control people instead of to free them. Time to change all that. We need a People's Computer Company. Of course, when we have globe-spanning networks and AI systems that can consume at this point probably a non-trivial fraction of humanity's energy resources, this feels hard to do. But I think taking this motto seriously, it's worth a shot. As long as we think about the humanistic approach to computers, one that's personal and human scale, connecting to many different ideas and bringing us along, as opposed to leaving us feeling left behind, one that makes us the best version of ourselves as opposed to tools to be used, I think we have a bright future ahead of us. Thank you.
All right, prepare yourselves. We're going to turn on the lights for Q&A, so get ready.
Okay.
All right, raise your hand, and I'll come by with the microphone. Those watching the live stream, you can type your questions in the Q&A chat box, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. And just a heads up, I think Dr. Dorfman mentioned the book signing with Rainy Day Books. We'll start that as soon as we end the Q&A. So we'll start up front here, and I'll work my way back.
So you mentioned earlier that computers were not really random. And is that true? I mean, can't there be a randomness to code like with AI?
So there can be a certain amount of non-determinism where it's kind of hard to figure out what the system is going to do. In general, in computing, they have things what are called pseudo-randomness, where you actually use mathematical equations that are so highly unpredictable, at least kind of the human mind, that you end up with things that have the properties of randomness, but are actually not random, in terms of the very clear mathematical context. That being said, so back in, I think it was in 1955, because randomness, true randomness is actually vital for understanding statistics and various other kinds of things and doing simulations. Back in the day, Rand, like the Rand Corporation, they published a book called, I think it was called like A Million Random Digits, and they basically made this like electronic like roulette machine, and it just like generated a whole bunch of random digits, and you could purchase this, and it was just a book of a million random digits. Nowadays, the pseudo-random algorithms are actually sophisticated enough. You probably don't need that for most situations, but occasionally people do need these things for like code making and code breaking, and there are services to help you with this kind of thing. There's actually, I think there's one website that uses a whole series of lava lamps, which are random, at least in terms of like, we can't really understand all the physical details, and like very small changes are different, and they have like a whole wall of lava lamps, and they use that as a way of generating random digits, and you can use that service. But yeah, it's but with AI, yeah, you are going to get different results each time, but that's not due to the inherent randomness. There's actually something within it called, there's a temperature variable, where like a parameter where you can kind of tune it up and down, and it changes how likely you are to kind of get the most likely next word. And so if the temperature is very low, if it's 0, then you're going to get the exact same thing every single time, and you can tune it up, and you get things that are weirder, and especially in the earlier versions of these AI systems, if the temperature was too high, you would get basically gibberish, but it would feel kind of random.
I see I'm up here on your left.
Yeah, you were talking about the physicality of computers, and there was I don't know if you've heard about a small town that had voting machines, electronic voting machines, and when they tallied up the votes, they were like 16,000 votes more than there were people in the town, and they couldn't figure out who cheated, who was causing this problem, and by backtracking in through,
It was like a cosmic ray, I think.
it was a cosmic ray. One gamma ray hit one bit in the computer and changed it 16,000.
Yeah, right. In general, right. Like you don't have to
really
worry
see
about these kinds of things, right, with your personal computers. But especially now, as we have these massive data centers and computing, like these massive servers, like these things, right, like at this scale, they need to actually be robust to gamma rays and cosmic radiation, because when you have a large enough system, right, it's going to have these kinds of things. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, it's an amazing story. I love collecting all these like weird failure systems.
All right, back here on your left.
Just to talk about the anti-optimism that you're speaking about. Are you familiar with Peter Thiel's recent discussions of the Antichrist? And
I did not listen to the talk. I read some summaries of it.
it's just kind of like the opposite of what you're discussing. He's behind Palantir and a lot of sophisticated computer systems, and you talk about myth, and he's bringing up the Antichrist. I was just wondering what you thought of that.
Yeah, so I did not listen to his entire talk, so I can't really speak to kind of the details of it. And for me, yeah, I mean, I kind of, it's sort of at the end, I was making this plea for kind of like technology at a human scale, and I think when we move away from that human scale, we get kind of a warping of incentives and things that often can be very strange and sometimes impersonal, and we have issues around big tech and things like that. And so I'm not quite sure I would go all the way to kind of the Antichrist or whatever he was talking about. But I definitely think, in many ways, like in the world of big tech and what we have right now, the path of least resistance is away from the kinds of things I'm talking about. But I'd like to think that the kinds of things I'm discussing, like they still do exist. Like I talked about like the poetic web or these cases for wonder and kind of this more personal kind of computing. It's there, but I think we need to make a concerted effort to find it and to actually nurture it, to make more of that. Because yeah, otherwise we feel like we're kind of just these cogs in this very, very large socio-technological system.
All right, Sam, back of the room on your right.
Thank you for your talk. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
It brings to mind the CrowdStrike Windows outage not very long ago. More recently, the AWS outage. It feels like with AI, there's a possibility of even stronger dependency on even fewer companies. What are your thoughts about that tendency to centralize?
Yeah, I mean, I think, right, those kinds of concerns are very valid, and like it's one of these situations, like we are already in this world where everything is entirely interconnected, and oftentimes we don't realize that until these kinds of failures sort of highlight that situation. Actually, related to the CrowdStrike thing, I actually wrote, like right soon after the CrowdStrike happen, I think within a few hours of it coming up. I actually had an essay published in The Atlantic about the failure, not because I was able to like write it so quickly and kind of anticipate it. It happened, I think, like over a year before that. The Atlantic had contacted me about complex technologies and glitches, and they said, can you write about some other failure? And I said, I can't. I was like about to, I think, go on travel with my family. I said, let's just write a piece and about sort of how to think about these complex technologies, because they are sort of ever present. And then when the next big failure comes, we'll kind of mention it. And so CrowdStrike happened, and I was able to kind of like get in very, very early. Unfortunately, because these kinds of things are an inevitable result of these complex technologies and the interconnectedness. And so there are ways of minimizing this kind of thing and maybe building some of these things around human scale that we kind of talked about. That being said, the forces that kind of lead towards greater interconnectivity, kind of accretion of greater more features, it means that there's always going to be this gap between our ability to understand these systems and how complex they are. And so I definitely want us to try to be as deliberate as possible to reduce these kinds of failures, but I think for better or for worse, they're kind of always going to be with us.
All right, Sam, back here on your left.
Hi. So I am one of the young people who's kind of like being due to, political reasons, tariffs, the ongoing like looming of what AI is going to do in the corporate world, that it is taking a toll on like my ability to start a like meaningful adult life and like find a good career. You are completely like infectious about your hope for technology, and it like rubs off. And half the time I am too. But for someone, like me, or maybe the grandkids of the people in this crowd, who is sitting there watching people who, watching our world shake up based on all of the hopes and projections and dreams that investment bankers, speculative funding is placing on AI. How do you have a prescription for like cultivating that sense of romanticism with computing to like get through the scarier times of the next 5-10 years?
That is a tall order. I do not think I have a clear answer. That being said, I mean, yes, like I certainly enjoy the wonderful aspects of computing, but I agree, like you need to be clear-eyed about these kinds of things. And I feel like right now, when we look toward like how people talk about technology, it often feels like there's kind of two extremes. There's like the sort of unalloyed delight in these things of like kind of like pedal to the metal, these things are going to be great, let's build AI, build these like super intelligent gods and everything's going to be solved. But of course it's going to kind of destroy aspects of the world in the process. Or be completely concerned about everything and can't see the good. And I've been trying to kind of carve out that sort of lonely in-between area. But I think that's really kind of the place where we need to actually be, which is saying, yeah, like there is a great deal of potential, but we still have to be clear-eyed about all these kinds of things. And how we do that, it's tough. But we need to have like a conversation as a society. I don't know what the answer is. But I think, yeah, maybe it involves like changing some of the incentives around how we build these kinds of things. Making certain things around like privacy more important when we build these AI systems. Recognizing that, yeah, AI might be a multiplier force for people who are already advanced in their careers, but could actually be decimating all of like the entry-level jobs. And there are people having these conversations. Like, it's not like I'm just kind of coming up with these things and no one else is talking about them. But we need to be able to kind of hold all of this in our minds together and say, like, yeah, these things have a great deal of potential, but also a great deal of peril. So let's try to like choose the kinds of things that actually work better for the kind of society we have. And so, I mean, I can't predict where the world is going to go in the next 5-10 years. I feel like right now we're in this weird situation. But like, for me, it's more like, okay, can we envision what that world would look like? Like, what is like the right way to build the world that we want? And then kind of work backwards. Like say, okay, what are the kinds of choices we make as a society or as a tech ecosystem that make those kinds of things more likely?
All right, let me go up front here. I'll come back for your question. Let me go up front here. As I'm walking, Ruth is watching virtually, and she asked, could you comment on the trade-off that society makes in choosing to improve our AI capabilities at the cost of energy consumption?
Yeah, I mean, we're in a weird moment. And yeah, I am glad that we're now having the conversation around AI and energy rather than AI, or sorry, rather than like energy and just like incinerating energy for like Bitcoin mining. So like, because that feels like even more wasteful. So like this is a little bit better and a little bit more useful. But right now, like we're using a lot, like, we're going to be using a lot of energy. That being said, I just saw this thing recently where I think Google was envisioning like creating this like constellation of like satellites around the Earth that kind of capture huge amounts of solar energy. And so, yeah, there maybe is a good version of this where, okay, we're going to need a lot more energy, but we're actually going to do it in a more sustainable way as opposed to just kind of, yeah, destroying lots of things. So hopefully there's a good path going forward.
Thank you for speaking to us this evening. And I have two questions. I have to ask this first one. Right in the front of your speech, you talked about Apple's little glitch. Well, that's it. Did Apple call that a glitch or a feature, being able to detect helium?
Oh, I don't actually think Apple weighed in on the situation.
They did.
Yeah.
It sounds like you like to compare the complexity of biology with the silicon designs. What do you think, your comments on where now they're putting cells on top of microchips?
Yeah, I mean, these worlds are increasingly blending together in weird ways. Yeah, I don't think, that one doesn't feel to me that worrying. I can see an endpoint, like a weird science fictional endpoint that is very strange and worrying, like where you're kind of, oh, like we're growing brains and then kind of connecting them to chips and who knows what's going on. At least in the near term, I think it's more exciting than worrying. But yeah, we'll see. But yeah, I feel like I saw something where someone connected a circuit to, I think, some insect to kind of understand how its brain was doing its thing. That was more for like scientific understanding rather than like harnessing its brain power, which is admittedly very limited. But yeah, these are interesting directions. And so yeah, I pay attention to them, but I am not entirely sure where they're going to go.
All right, towards the back of the room here in the middle.
Thank you for being here. This is a fluff question. Are you more excited about your Erdos number or your bacon number?
Ooh, that's a fun one. So to be clear, yeah, the bacon one, so I did not interact with Kevin Bacon. It was a documentary about network science, and so obviously there's like the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. I was an extra in a scene with my grad school advisor where he just basically needed some students since we were kind of sitting in the background. I'm excited about that one. I would say is more exciting because Erdos number, at this point, any scientist has a pretty low Erdos number. So for those who don't know, so Paul Erdos, he was a mathematician who was incredibly prolific. I think he wrote like on the order of like 500 articles with many, many co-authors. And so the idea is like, how many hops away are you from Erdos? That's kind of a measure of distance in mathematics. But the truth is, because he's written with so many people, even if you're outside of math, you actually have a fairly low number. So that one's less exciting. The bacon one is kind of fun, even though I probably got it through some technicality that most people don't count, but I'll count it anyway.
Hey, it counts. Any other questions?
Oh, there's one back there.
Oh, yes, sir.
Since you started with science fiction, do you see a world where simulated computer life can be hooked to a 3D printer?
Oh, and like make actual living thing. So there was some research, I think now like 25 years ago, where because it turns out, so the idea of evolution, obviously it's a process in biology and life and the world. It's also in many ways an algorithm. It is saying, okay, you have a population of something, it could be equations, it could be organisms. There's variation among them. And then they reproduce, and then some are more fit than others, and those reproduce more, and then you kind of have and you have more and more generations. It turns out you can actually embody this within computers. It's called evolutionary computation. And about 25 years ago, I think there was these researchers, they used this to simulate different kind of like virtual like organisms that kind of walked, and they wanted to find ones that could walk better than others. And then the ones that actually did very well, they then actually, I think, 3D printed them and created these weird walking organisms. And then and there was obviously a certain amount of human effort that had to go into it as well, like connecting some motors and things like that. But yeah, people have done some of these kinds of things in small ways, and I'm sure it's going to get even easier. Right now, 3D printers are not kind of making things go wild, but there is you can right now, and going back to like just pure biology, there are services where you can give them a DNA sequence and it will make it for you, and they can do it by mail. And so people have talked about like whether or not this you could create weird like bioweapons and things like that. And there are certain conditions to kind of make it less likely. But yeah, there is a weird feedback between creating DNA and then evolving it in silico and then creating things that are wildly different and then releasing in the world. It does feel a little science fictional, but increasingly more and more real, which is, and I feel like that is kind of the fact of our age, which is like we have kind of outpaced our science fiction in many ways, and we like don't really know what to do. Like we're in this very kind of scrambled sort of moment.
All right, Sam, let me come on stage here. We'll end with this question from Joe, one of our online viewers. The question is, can you talk about your work with the two questions actually.
Right.
Can you talk about your work with the Long Now Foundation, and what is a long-term hope that you have for the next generation of computing?
Okay. Oh, that's wonderful. So yeah, so the Long Now Foundation, for those who don't know, it's a foundation based in San Francisco devoted to kind of promoting very long-term thinking. So to give you an example of that, their flagship project is to build a clock, like a giant clock inside like a mountain in like western Texas that is designed to last for 10,000 years. And the idea behind this, which sounds kind of crazy, is in the process of building a clock for 10,000 years, you will have thought about material science and geopolitics and linguistic evolution and all these kind of crazy things, and really sort of think very long term. And so my involvement is very, very low level. I just have a title along with them. I am not involved in the clock. The things I've talked to them about are around organizational continuity. So the idea is like as this clock is actually nearing completion, they realize, oh, if the clock is going to last for 10,000 years, we might have to think about how to build a foundation that can actually last for a very long time. And so a number of people affiliated with Long Now have thought about like what does it mean to have organizations or companies or things that can last for a very long amount of time. And so I've done some thinking around like organizational, I guess, like permanence. And so people have looked, and so for example, this is not my work, but like one of the people involved has actually found, so there's probably the longest lived company ever. I think it lasted for about 1,500 years and then went, I think, bankrupt in like 2006, which is kind of sad because it was lasted for so long. It was a company that built, it was a construction company that built Shinto temples in Japan, and then I think eventually was kind of folded into some other construction company. But you can look at like monasteries, you can look at other kinds of like very long-lived institutions, and so that's kind of one of the things that I've been involved with that. And so but then to the second question around what is my hope for the future of computing, I guess related to some of like kind of the interplay to biology and computers, I just think right now, I mean, like the current mode of computers, which is basically all computers that we use are kind of built on top of sort of a single framework called like the von Neumann architecture. But there's so many other ways of building computers, whether it's biological and people have actually built, I think they've used slime molds to actually optimize and solve mathematical problems, and you can use like DNA to like factor large numbers. I just think there's so many different ways of computing. This is kind of part of a larger area called unconventional computing, and so I think there's a lot of possibility there, and so that's kind of what I'm very interested to follow in the years to come.
That's great stuff. Thank you so much, Dr. Arbesman.
Thank you.
It's great to have you back.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for attending tonight's program. As always, go to lindahall.org for information on all of our upcoming events and services. But don't leave yet. We're going to start the book signing here in a couple of minutes. Get your signed copy of The Magic of Code. So thank you.
Thank you.